Yeah, the investigator said calmly, like he was reading a grocery list. She didn't leave because she needed space. That was the sentence. No warning. No buildup. Just that. And my stomach dropped like I'd missed a step in the dark. I was standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the same spot on the counter I'd stared at 4 years earlier when she told me she was done. When she said she needed to find herself. When she looked past me like I was already part of her old life. What do you mean? I asked, even though my body already knew. He exhaled softly. The inheritance didn't change her plans. It accelerated them. She'd been preparing to leave months before you think. Accounts. Conversations. A relationship you weren't supposed to know about. I had to sit down. For 4 years, I told myself a story that made the pain survivable. That money had gone to her head. That grief from losing a parent scrambled her emotions. That I wasn't enough after, not before. But hearing a stranger confirm that it was all calculated, that hurt in a way I wasn't prepared for. She didn't just walk away, he continued. She erased you. Socially, financially, emotionally. By the time she told you, she was already gone. I remembered her face that day. Calm, almost relieved. How she said, I don't owe you explanations, when I asked what I'd done wrong. For years later, standing alone in that same kitchen, I realized something brutal. The marriage hadn't ended when she left. It ended when money showed her who she really was, and who I wasn't worth being honest with. She packed lightly. That's the detail that never left me. One suitcase, not even full, like she was going on a short trip and just forgot to mention when she'd be back. I remember standing in the doorway, watching her fold clothes with that distant efficiency people use when they're already somewhere else. I'm not trying to hurt you, she said, not looking at me. I just need more than this. More than me, she meant. But she never said it out loud. I asked if there was someone else. She sighed, annoyed, like I'd asked an immature question. Why do you always need a villain? She said. This isn't about cheating. This is about growth. Growth was her favorite word that week. Growth, space, clarity. All clean words that made abandonment sound enlightened. When I asked about the timing, why now? Why so suddenly? She stiffened. I don't owe you a timeline, she said. I've been unhappy for a long time. That was news to me. We'd planned a vacation 2 months earlier. She'd laughed at dinner the night before. She'd kissed me goodbye that morning. She zipped the suitcase and finally met my eyes. There was no anger there. No guilt either. Just resolve. Like she'd crossed a finish line, and I was something she'd had to run past to get there. At the door, she paused. For half a second, I thought she might hesitate. Say something real. Something honest. Instead, she said, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Then she left. I stood there long after the sound of her car faded, staring at the closed door, trying to understand how someone could walk out of a shared life so cleanly, as if they'd already practiced the motion in their head 100 times. For years later, I finally knew. She had. The inheritance didn't arrive like a windfall. It arrived quietly, wrapped in paperwork and condolences. A phone call, a lawyer's email, numbers that felt unreal at first, like they belonged to someone else's life. At the time, I thought the stress explained her distance. Grief can do strange things, I told myself. Money complicates emotions. People need time. I bent over backward to be patient, supportive, invisible when needed. What I didn't see, or didn't want to, was how fast her posture changed. She started talking differently. Not about us, but about options. About freedom. About how people outgrow relationships that no longer align with their future. She said it casually, like she was quoting something she'd read, not describing the man sitting across from her. She stopped asking my opinion on plans. Stopped looping me into decisions. When I mentioned joint finances, she waved it off. Let's not mix things right now, she said. It's cleaner. Cleaner for who? The money gave her something she hadn't had before, leverage. Not just financial, emotional. She didn't need reassurance anymore. Didn't need compromise. Didn't need to explain herself. Independence stopped being a goal and became a shield. Looking back, I can see the shift clearly. The inheritance didn't corrupt her. It clarified her priorities. It removed the need to pretend we were building something together when she was already imagining life without me. She didn't leave because the money changed her. She left because it finally allowed her to stop needing me, and she mistook that for growth. The distance didn't announce itself. It seeped in quietly, like a draft you don't notice until the room feels cold. She was still there, still sharing the same space, but something essential had shut off. She stopped touching me first. Hugs became brief, distracted. Kisses landed on my cheek instead of my mouth. When I reached for her at night, she'd sigh softly and turn away, saying she was tired, stressed, not in the mood. Always reasonable. Always untouchable. Conversations changed too. She listened without really hearing. Responded without engaging. I'd talk about my day and realize halfway through that she was scrolling, nodding on autopilot. When I asked what was wrong, she smiled thinly and said, "Nothing. I'm fine." Fine became her favorite word. Fine meant closed. She started protecting her inner world from me. Phone always face down. Laptop angled away. Taking calls in the other room. When I asked who she was talking to, she'd raise an eyebrow like I'd crossed a line. "Do I need permission now?" she'd say. I told myself I was being paranoid. That grief explained it. That money stress explained it. That I should give her space, because that's what a supportive husband does. But space, I learned, can be a slow goodbye. The warmth between us didn't fade because of one fight or betrayal I could point to. It faded because she was already emotionally relocating. Building a life I wasn't invited into. Practicing indifference while I was still trying to connect. By the time she finally said she was leaving, the distance felt familiar. Almost rehearsed. And that's what hurt the most. Realizing she hadn't fallen out of love suddenly. She'd been leaving me quietly, day by day, while I was still standing right there. The words came before the exit. That's what I understand now. Long before she packed a bag, she was already loosening the ground under us with sentences that sounded harmless if you didn't line them up. "I just feel like I'm evolving," she said one night, swirling her wine like it held answers. "You wouldn't understand what I need right now." That one stayed with me. Not because it was cruel, but because it was final. It placed me on the outside of her future without directly saying so. She started rewriting our history in real time. We were never really that close. You depended on me more than you realize. I think we stayed together out of comfort. Each statement landed like a quiet correction, as if she were editing a story I thought we'd live together. I'd push back gently, remind her of shared plans, memories, promises. She'd smile and say, "That's not how I remember it." Gaslighting doesn't always look aggressive. Sometimes it sounds reflective, mature, reasonable. When I asked where this was coming from, she sighed, clearly tired of the conversation. "I don't owe you constant reassurance," she said. "I need to prioritize myself for once." For once. As if the years we'd built together were some kind of charity project she'd outgrown. What hurt wasn't just the content, it was the confidence. She spoke like someone who had already decided how this would end and was just laying verbal breadcrumbs toward the door. I kept trying to adapt, to listen better, to give her space without disappearing. But every sentence she added created more distance, not clarity. Those phrases weren't attempts at honesty. They were rehearsals. And by the time she finally said she was leaving, I'd already heard the goodbye a dozen different ways. I just hadn't wanted to believe they were all pointing to the same ending. The divorce itself was quiet. That's what made it unbearable. No screaming. No dramatic accusations. Just paperwork, neutral tones, and a version of her that spoke to me like I was a former coworker she wanted to keep things amicable with. She kept thanking me for being so understanding, like my confusion was a favor she appreciated. Every time I asked why, she redirected. "This isn't about blame. I don't want to rehash the past. We've both changed." Changed into what? That was the question she never answered. She refused counseling. Said it would only drag things out. Refused specifics. Said they would only cause more pain. It was a masterclass in emotional efficiency, and a marriage without ever naming the real reason. At one point, I asked her directly if there was someone else. She looked almost offended. "I can't believe you'd reduce it to that," she said, as if I'd need someone else to leave. That sentence haunted me for years. It made me feel small, replaceable, like the problem wasn't betrayal. It was my assumption that I mattered enough to be betrayed for. The settlement was clean. Too clean. She didn't fight for things she once cared about. Didn't argue over details couples usually argue over. It was like she was paying a fee to exit a life she'd already emotionally abandoned. When it was over, people told me I was lucky. No drama. No court battles. No bitterness. But walking away without answers leaves a different kind of damage. One that turns inward. One that convinces you the truth must be something so bad, it couldn't even be spoken out loud. For a long time, I believed that silence was mercy. For years later, I learned it was strategy. The years after the divorce were quieter than I expected. No explosions, no dramatic lows, just a steady, grinding doubt that followed me everywhere like background noise I couldn't turn off. I replayed everything, every argument, every missed cue. Every night, I chose work over conversation, or silence over pushing back. I told myself if I'd been more attentive, more ambitious, more something, she wouldn't have left so cleanly. Friends tried to help, but their reassurance slid right off me. People grow apart. Sometimes there's no bad guy, but that explanation never sat right. It felt too neat for the way she'd detached so completely, for the way she'd spoken like I was an inconvenience she'd finally outgrown. I blamed myself for not seeing it sooner, for trusting her words over my instincts, for believing love meant patience even when patience turned into self-erasure. Every unanswered question became proof that I must have failed in some fundamental way. Dating was worse. I second-guessed everything I said, apologized too quickly, over-explained. I was terrified of being not enough again, of waking up one day to another calm goodbye I didn't see coming. What hurt most was the uncertainty. Not knowing whether I'd been lied to or simply left behind. Not knowing if the marriage had been real for her at all, or just convenient until it wasn't. Self-blame is seductive like that. It gives you control. If it was my fault, then at least there was a reason. At least the world still made sense. I carried that belief for years because the alternative, that she left without honesty, without remorse, was harder to accept. It wasn't until much later that I realized something crucial. I wasn't punishing myself because I was guilty. I was punishing myself because I didn't yet know the truth. I didn't hire a detective because I wanted revenge. I hired one because the story I'd been telling myself was starting to crack. For years had passed, and instead of healing, I felt stuck in the same unanswered moment. Therapy helped me cope, but it couldn't give me facts. Friends told me to move on, but you can't move on from a question mark. You just circle it endlessly. What pushed me over the edge was something small. I ran into an old mutual acquaintance at a coffee shop. We exchanged pleasantries, and then she hesitated, just long enough to make my stomach tighten. I always wondered how you handled everything, she said carefully. Everything? I asked. She changed the subject too quickly, the way people do when they've already said too much. That night, I couldn't sleep. I realized I'd been protecting my ex-wife's image even after she left. I'd accepted vagueness because clarity might hurt more. But living inside a lie was hurting me every single day. Hiring the detective felt surreal. Clinical. I told him I wasn't looking for drama, just truth. Timeline. Context. Anything concrete. He nodded like he'd heard that 1,000 times. Most people don't want dirt, he said. They want permission to stop blaming themselves. That hit harder than I expected. I gave him what little I had. Dates, names, inconsistencies I'd brushed off. As I signed the contract, my hands shook. Part of me hoped he'd find nothing, that this was all in my head. But another part of me, the part that had been quietly screaming for years, needed to know whether my pain had been built on silence or on deception. That's why I hired him, not to reopen the past, but to finally close it. When I hired the investigator, I had a theory, not a dramatic one, just something manageable, something I could live with. I thought he'd confirm that she'd met someone after the divorce, that she'd moved on faster than she admitted. That maybe she'd emotionally checked out near the end and just didn't have the courage to say it out loud. Painful, yes, but ordinary, human. I even prepared myself to hear that I'd been replaced quickly, that she'd found someone more aligned with her new life. Someone who fit better once money entered the picture. I told myself I could accept that. People leave. People choose differently. It wouldn't mean the marriage was fake, just finite. What I wasn't prepared for was the idea of intention. I didn't expect timelines. Preparations. Conversations happening while she still slept next to me. I didn't expect to learn that decisions I thought were mutual had already been finalized without me in the room. In my head, the worst-case scenario was impulsive betrayal, not strategic exit. I kept imagining the investigator calling and saying something vague. There were signs. It's complicated. She wasn't fully honest. Things that would still leave room for interpretation. Because interpretation is familiar. It's what I'd lived in for 4 years. Part of me hoped the truth would be small, disappointing, but not devastating. Something that wouldn't force me to reevaluate every memory, every conversation, Every moment I defended her when others questioned how clean the split had been. I told myself I wasn't strong enough for something worse. Looking back now, I understand how naive that was. When someone leaves with certainty and zero guilt, it's rarely spontaneous. It's usually rehearsed. What I thought I'd find was closure with rough edges. What I didn't yet realize was that the truth wouldn't just explain why she left. It would change what the marriage had always been. What I actually found was a timeline. Clean, methodical, unforgiving. The investigator didn't dramatize it. He laid it out piece by piece, like evidence in a case that had already been decided. Messages sent months before the inheritance was finalized. Meetings that overlapped with business trips, she said, were too short to come along on. A separate account opened quietly, long before she ever said the word space. And then there was him. Not a mystery. Not a mistake. Someone she'd known before me. Someone who reappeared the moment money entered the picture. Not as a savior, but as a plan. Conversations that weren't emotional at first, just practical. Logistics. Timing. What life could look like after. That part broke something in me. Because it meant the goodbye wasn't hard for her. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't fueled by confusion or grief. It was calculated. Clean enough that when she finally walked out, she could do it without shaking. She didn't hesitate, the investigator said. By the time she told you, she'd already moved on emotionally. I thought about her calm that day. The way she packed lightly. The way she spoke like she was explaining a decision she'd already justified to herself 100 times. I asked the question I'd avoided for years. So, was any of it real? The investigator paused. It was real, he said carefully. Until it wasn't useful anymore. That answer hurt more than anger ever could. Because what I actually found wasn't just betrayal. It was proof that while I was still trying to save a marriage, she was already designing her exit and making sure she'd land softly. Once I had the facts, the lies lined up on their own. I didn't have to force them anymore. They connected naturally, like puzzle pieces I'd been stepping around for years because I was afraid of the picture they'd form. Her sudden interest in financial independence. The way she insisted we keep certain accounts separate. How she discouraged long-term plans right after the inheritance came through, saying, "Let's not rush the future." I remembered the trips she framed as self-care. The late nights she blamed on exhaustion. The conversations she shut down with, "You're reading into things." Each lie wasn't dramatic on its own. That's why they worked. That's why I swallowed them. She didn't just lie about what she was doing. She lied about why she was changing. She framed distance as growth. Secrecy as boundaries. Detachment as maturity. And I played along because I wanted to believe her evolution didn't require my disappearance. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was leverage. It gave her options, and once she had options, honesty became inconvenient. I wasn't a partner anymore. I was a variable to manage until the timing felt right. What hurt most was realizing how often I'd defended her to myself. How I'd translated her coldness into stress, her absence into grief, her indifference into strength. I wasn't stupid, I was loyal. And loyalty, without transparency, becomes a weapon you use against yourself. The lies weren't just about affairs or finances. They were about reality. She controlled the narrative so thoroughly that even after she left, I stayed trapped inside her version of events. Connecting the lies didn't bring immediate relief. It brought grief, the kind that comes when you realize you weren't wrong, just misled. And for the first time in years, my self-blame loosened its grip. Because the truth was finally louder than her silence. Clarity didn't arrive like a revelation. It settled in slowly, heavy, and unavoidable. Once the lies were exposed, I couldn't look at the marriage the same way again. Not the good parts, not the bad, not even the memories I used to protect. I saw how often I'd been accommodating while she was calculating. How compromise only ever moved in one direction. How my role had quietly shifted from partner to support system, from equal to convenience. Moments I once thought were intimacy now looked like placeholders. Promises felt conditional. Even her affection had timing. Warmer when she needed reassurance. Colder when she was securing her next step. What stunned me most was realizing how early the imbalance started. The inheritance didn't create the entitlement, it revealed it. Money didn't change her values, it removed the need to hide them. I remembered arguments where I apologized just to restore peace. Times I minimized my needs because she framed them as pressure. I told myself that was love. That sacrifice meant maturity. In reality, I was training myself to accept less while calling it growth. Seeing the marriage clearly meant admitting something painful. I wasn't abandoned suddenly. I was slowly devalued, then discarded once I no longer fit the version of life she wanted to build. And yet, that clarity brought relief. Because if the marriage was built on imbalance, then its collapse wasn't a personal failure. It was an inevitable outcome of staying loyal to someone who'd already stopped being loyal to the truth. For the first time, I wasn't asking what I did wrong. I was asking why I stayed so long trying to prove my worth to someone who'd already decided my value had limits. The collapse didn't happen when I read the report. It happened weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday, when there was nothing left to distract me from the truth. I was standing in my kitchen, staring at a mug I'd already washed, when it hit me all at once. There was nothing to fix. No misunderstanding to resolve. No version of events where I could have said the right thing and changed the outcome. My chest tightened like my body had finally caught up to what my mind already knew. I sat down on the floor and felt everything I'd postponed for years rush in without permission. Anger at her, grief for myself, humiliation for how long I'd defended someone who was quietly dismantling my life. I wasn't crying the way people do in movies. It was worse than that. Silent, shaking, like something inside me had finally snapped from holding too much weight for too long. What broke me wasn't the betrayal. It was realizing how alone I'd been inside the marriage. I remembered nights lying next to her, feeling lonely without understanding why. Remembered shrinking my needs so she wouldn't feel burdened. Remembered how often I chose peace over truth, and how expensive that choice turned out to be. I thought clarity would make me feel stronger immediately. Instead, it stripped me bare, took away the last illusion that there was still something to save, or someone to explain myself to. But at the bottom of that collapse was something unexpected: stillness. No more chasing answers. No more defending her. No more rewriting myself to fit someone else's comfort. I didn't rebuild that day. I just stopped bleeding inward. And that, I realized later, was the beginning of strength, not the end of weakness. Letting go wasn't dramatic. There was no final speech, no symbolic gesture, no moment where I felt suddenly free. It was quieter than that, and harder. The illusion I had to release wasn't just about her. It was about who I thought we were, who I thought I was inside that marriage. I had clung to the idea that if I understood enough, forgave enough, endured enough, it would all make sense. That love was a puzzle you could solve with patience. But the truth was simpler and more brutal. I was loyal to a version of her that stopped existing long before she left. Once I accepted that, something shifted. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, trying to spot the moment I could have changed everything. I stopped imagining alternate outcomes where she chose honesty over convenience. I stopped wondering if closure would feel different if she had just explained herself better. Because the explanation was already there, written in her actions. Letting go meant admitting that the marriage I mourned was partly an illusion I helped maintain. I ignored my instincts. I downplayed my discomfort. I confused emotional withdrawal for independence and silence for strength. That realization stung, but it also returned something to me: agency. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't discarded because I was unworthy. I stayed because I believed in commitment, and I stayed too long because I believed it had to be one-sided to count. The illusion didn't shatter all at once. It faded, and as it did, I felt lighter, less angry, less desperate to be understood by someone who had already moved on. Letting go wasn't forgiving her. It was finally choosing not to abandon myself anymore. Acceptance didn't feel like peace at first. It felt like exhaustion. The kind that comes after you stop fighting a reality that was never going to change for you. I stopped asking why she did it, and started asking why I tolerated it. That question changed everything. Final clarity wasn't about her betrayal anymore. It was about my boundaries. I saw, with painful precision, how often I'd mistaken endurance for love and silence for maturity. I believed loyalty meant staying, even when respect quietly left the room. I believed commitment meant patience, even when patience turned into self-erasure. The truth is this: she didn't just leave when she got the inheritance. She left when she no longer needed to pretend we were equals. Money didn't create her exit. It simply removed the risk. And here's the part that finally set me free. Someone who can walk away without honesty was never protecting you. They were protecting themselves. I no longer need her version of events. I no longer need validation from someone who rewrote reality to suit their comfort. The answers I chased for years didn't heal me. Understanding myself did. If you're reading this and you're stuck in confusion, hear this clearly. When someone leaves without answers, don't assume it's because the truth is complicated. Sometimes it's because the truth is inconvenient. And when someone shows you that loyalty is optional to them, believe them. Love without respect isn't love. And loyalty should never be one-sided. That's the clarity I live with now. And it's enough.